This video will touch on the life of King Camp Gillette, the Razor King, but I'll also talk about his brothers and sisters, my husband's first cousins, 2 times removed. I'll also touch on 2 times great-grand aunt and uncle George W. Gillette and his wife Fanny Camp Gillette. Almost all the photos have been sharpened and colorized. We'll start with Fanny Gillette Stevens. She was an actress in her younger years. I wonder if her parents approved of that. She married an actor named Landers Stevens in 1895 when she was 23, and he was 21. In 1900, they lived in Alameda, California. They were only married for about 6 years and were annulled or divorced. In 1910, Jenny was living in the lap of luxury with her brother and his family and using her married name Stevens, which could mean the marriage to Landers was a divorce. By 1910, she was 43. The census showed she was a widow. Well, I found the day after John Landers Stevens divorced Fanny, he married Georgia Cooper. He was obviously having a long-standing affair with Georgia. Fanny didn't like it, and her husband was dead to her, so she claimed she was a widow. Fanny moved back to New York. She moved in with her brother, King, and his family and lots of servants on Beacon Street in Norfolk, Massachusetts. I do have a picture of how it looks today. I believe it's one of these buildings. Let's see. Fanny died soon after in 1912 at the age of about, 45 or so. Her body was brought back to California to be buried with the family. Now we'll move on to her sister Lena. Lena Gillette was born in 1850 in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Her parents were pretty well off. Her father, of course we know, was an inventor of the razor, so they had money. But at the time of her birth, George Wolcott was the editor of the newspaper in the town. He was 26 and his wife, Fanny, was 22. In 1850, then Lena was only 4 months old, and her sister Adele was 1. Julie Gillette, 18, lived with them, and they had 3 servants, and the servants were 14, 16, and 18 years old. By 1860, Lena was 10, and Adele had already died. Matt, George, and King had been born, and the family had moved to Chicago. They had 1 servant named Mary Weck. She was 24 and she was from Ireland. 10 years later, Lena was 21 and the family had grown to 5 children. By 1900, Lena was unmarried and still living with her parents, and they were living in Manhattan by that time. Her father had invented the shearing machine. Her brother, George, was working in the manufacturing of the shearing machine. By 1910, Lena had moved in with her brother King and his family and all their servants in Brookline, Norfolk, Massachusetts. Lena was 60 by then. 10 years later, Lena was living with her mom and 2 brothers, including King and his wife, in the Beverly Hills Hotel. She was living the life of luxury until the end. Lena died at the age of 76 and is buried in the family mausoleum in California. And this is her obituary, part of it anyway. Funeral services for Miss Lena Gillette, sister of King Camp Gillette, safety razor manufacturer, will be held tomorrow at the Little Church of the Flowers. Miss Gillette is survived by her years, was resident of California. She had been an invalid for several years, but it was not until about a month ago that her condition became serious. Miss Gillette is survived by her mother, Miss Fanny Gillette, a brother and a nephew, and several relatives, all residents of California. Well, next we'll talk about George a little. Brother George. I really don't have a lot about him, but he was a manufacturer of the shearing machine. In 1900, he was still single and living with his parents and Lena in Manhattan. He was 47 years old. Within 10 years, he had married a woman named Ethel. They were living in Manhattan on Riverside Drive. They had a lodger and 2 servants, so they were living well. Soon they moved to LA, and I believe they moved in with the family at the Beverly Hills Hotel. He died in 1915 in LA, and he's buried, or should I say placed, in the family mausoleum. Ethel stayed in LA and rented an apartment there, so she lived on. Now we'll talk about Mott George Gillette, not Matt, M-A-T-T, Mott, M-O-T-T. He was born November 1851. He lived with his parents, who moved around a lot. In 1870, at 18, he was living in Chicago with his parents. On November 11th, 1896, Mott married Hedvig Alexandra Cecilia Trofast. She was born in Sweden. Together they had 2 sons, George Wolcott Trofast Gillette. He was born in Pittsburgh, and Elman Camp Trofast Gillette. He was born in New York in 1899. The family made their home in New York, where Mott continued his inventive work. An odd thing about Hedda and Mott is that I can only find them living together in a 1915 census from New York. In that census, he lived with Hedvig and the 2 boys. In the 1900 census, I find Hedda living in Garden City, New York. The record shows she's married. This is a picture of the home today. Now we fast forward to 1920. I find Mott in 1920 living with his family in the Beverly Hills Hotel. It shows he's married, but Hedvig, or Hedda, is not there, although she is reported at some social events at the hotel. So Mott is at the Beverly Hills Hotel with family in 1920, and Hedda is living in the same house 20 years later, back in New York, in Garden City. Now her boys are 20 and 22. Mott died in 1926, and I'll talk about that now. In Find a Grave, there's a really nice memorial story about him. It talks about when he was born and who his parents were, and then it says, Mott grew up in the Midwest, moving east, where he built a career as an inventor and businessman. Working independently of his brother's celebrated company, he pursued a range of mechanical innovations. His inventive spirit produced a U.S. patent in 1925 for improvements in safety razors, and another in 1926 for buttonless trousers. Now I'm going to have to look up the buttonless trousers. He demonstrated a flair for both practical and forward-looking designs. Earlier in 1887, he had also developed a sheep shearing machine and made arrangements to market it in Australia, evidence of his international entrepreneurial reach and mechanical ingenuity long before his latter patents. Then it talks about him marrying Hedda. Mott died in 1926, and he was the first of his family to be placed in an underground mausoleum at Locust Valley Cemetery, Garden City, New York. The underground mausoleum is marked with only 1 stone. There is no above-ground entry. Hedda lived on in Garden City until 1958. She died at the great old age of 90, and she rests in the family mausoleum. Now we're going to talk about King and his wife Atlanta. King is kind of the star of the show here. He's my husband's first cousin, 2 times removed. I have a video about King Gillette, so I hope I have a different spin on this one. There's all kinds of information online about King if someone wanted to dig farther. King was born January 1855 in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. His parents, George Wolcott Gillette and Fanny, were very successful in their own right. When King was 15, the family was living in Chicago, and they had one servant from Ireland. She was a live-in servant. 10 years later, the family lives on East 50th in New York City. King's occupation was salesman. His brother George, who we talked about earlier, was a salesman also. Mott was the only son who had moved out. George W., his father, his occupation was inventor, so all the boys of the family were working in the same business. King was 25 in 1880. 10 years after the census was taken, King married Atlanta. She was 20 and he was 35 when they got married, I guess in 1890. I can't find any census records for anyone from 1890. By 1900, King and Atlanta, they had their boy named King also, and one servant from Ireland. King's occupation was salesman, machinery, wholesale. They lived in Brookline, Massachusetts, on Marion Street. By the 1910 census, that's 10 years later, King had hit the jackpot by inventing the disposable razors. His occupation was president, industry, safety razor. Now they live on Beacon Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, and they have 9 live-in servants. And they have the wife and son of the chauffeur. I think of the movie Sabrina, where she and her father had an apartment above the garages. In 1910, he was 54 and Atlanta was 41. The people who lived with them were his mother. She lived in there. She was 81. And his sisters, Fanny and Lena, along with his mother-in-law and all that staff. By 1920, we have a big change. We have the whole family, Mom, Fanny, Lena, Mott, King Gillette, and Atlanta, living in the Beverly Hills Hotel, being waited on hand and foot, living high. The census shows Fanny as the head, and by now she is 91 years old. King is 65. It shows that he is still president of the Razor Company, although he had retired from active management as early as 1913. And Atlanta is there, and she's 51. The Beverly Hills Hotel was founded by Margaret Anderson, who is shown here as also living in the hotel with her husband, kids, and mother, and pages of live-in staff. The workers came from all over Europe, Japan, China, the Philippines, and many born in the United States. I looked up why all these people were on the census as living there and found that in 1920 it was common for staff to live at the hotel. Most were in common rooms, I gather, like dormitory style. If a person had a more prestigious job, they had better accommodations. The family was reported at many social events at the hotel, so they were living grand. In 1926, King had acquired his ranch in the Santa Monica Mountains. The 25-room house was complete in 1929, soon after the stock market crashed and King lost his fortune. King had been operated on several times for an intestinal malady. and he died at the ranch with Atlanta and his son by his side. His condition had been serious, but he wasn't expected to die. His obituary gives a summary of his life. Atlanta sold the property in 1935 to an MGM film executive. The land changed hands over the years, and at one time it was the property of a New Age cult. Now it's a public parks land. Well, Atlanta moved on. She rented a modest house in Los Angeles, and in 1940 she shows up in a census with her longtime maid, Emily Ross. And she also has a lodger, and he's 75. Emily Ross also shows up in the 1930 census living with King in Atlanta, and Emily's sister was a lodger, Rosina. She was a lodger. So then in 1950, Atlanta is still living in the same place in Los Angeles. She has the same lodger, and Emily Ross is still there with her also. Atlanta died the next year and was placed in the family mausoleum in Los Angeles. I found Atlanta's obituary, and it said she died at 82. She was the widow of King Camp Gillette, the inventor of the safety razor, and she had been a resident of Los Angeles since 1912. Mrs. Gillette died Tuesday at her home. She leaves a son, King G. Gillette of Palm Desert, California. And this is what's so interesting. Most of the multi-million-dollar fortune of the family was lost during the Depression. And also, I found that her maid that she had for, I don't know if it was 20 or 30 years, she died in October of that year of 1951. Before I conclude this video, I must say something about King and Atlanta's son. He was named King also, and he declared bankruptcy in 1942, a little over 10 years before his mother died. And he died at 64 in 1955. But I must say also, in 1948, 98 acres of land belonging to King Gillette, that's the son, has been acquired by Palm Beach Village Land Company. It became known yesterday. The amount involved is reported to be in the neighborhood of $85,000. It was reliably learned. The newly acquired property lies in the northeasterly direction from the present development of Palm Village. So at one time, all of what now compromises Palm Village was part of the original King Gillette holdings on the desert. So they ended up losing all their money, and eventually, I think sometime, I think it was 2005, Procter & Gamble bought the Gillette company, but the actual family had lost the company and their fortune during the Great Depression in 1929. I hope you enjoyed the story of King Gillette and his brothers and sisters. Till next time, bye.